Okay, so picture this. You're a baker, right? And you make like the best sourdough, like in your state, maybe even, the whole country,
The best.
the best. And you've got a website, people order your bread online. It's this whole thing, right?
Okay.
And then out of the blue, you get hit with a lawsuit
Uh-oh.
from a customer in Alaska.
Alas.
Alaska. And you've never even been to Alaska, let alone, sold a loaf there. How can they sue you in a state that's like basically another country away?
Yeah, that's the thing about jurisdiction. It can be a real curveball, right? Especially if you're, on the receiving end of a lawsuit in some place you wouldn't expect. So this whole scenario, it really boils down to something called in personam jurisdiction. It's basically the court's power to like make you show up and defend yourself.
Yeah.
And the rules about like where you can be sued, well, they've gotten a lot more complex than just, being physically present somewhere these days.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole jurisdiction thing because it sounds like maybe something I should probably understand, especially with my, online business and everything.
Oh, absolutely. So traditionally, courts, they establish jurisdiction over someone in a few ways, right? Like if you were physically present in a state and, you got served with those court papers, generally the court had you.
Right.
Or like if you consented to be sued in a specific state, say through a contract or something, well, then you were bound by that agreement.
So basically you step foot in a state, you get served, or you sign your rights away, and, well, you're stuck. Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it might seem that way, but, as always, things got a little tricky. The world got more connected, especially with businesses operating across all these state lines. And that's where this really game-changing case, International Shoe v. Washington, comes into play.
International shoe. Okay, that one sounds serious.
It was a landmark case. Like, it really shifted the entire landscape of personal jurisdiction. The Supreme Court, they basically said you don't need a physical presence in a state to be sued there anymore. What really mattered was whether you had these things called minimum contacts with that state.
So just because my bakery is, say, in California, doesn't mean I'm off the hook if I sell a loaf to someone in, like, I don't know, Texas online.
Exactly. That's the heart of it. You see, courts started looking at whether a company was purposefully, engaging with the state, like through its business activities, even without having a physical office there. And that's where this idea of purposeful availment comes in.
Purposeful availment. Sounds kind of like a legal term for you meant to do business there or something like that.
You got it. It means that the defendant, the person or the company being sued, they didn't just like stumble into a lawsuit in that state. They made a conscious choice to interact with that state's market in some way.
So if I'm like selling my amazing sourdough online,
Yeah.
right? And somebody in Texas orders a loaf, does that automatically mean I can be sued in Texas if something, goes wrong with the order?
Well, it's not quite that cut and dry, The court, they would look at whether you've, like, directed your business activities toward Texas in a meaningful way. Like, did you specifically target customers in Texas, maybe through your website or marketing? Do you ship, a significant amount of bread to Texas regularly? These are the kinds of things courts consider when they're trying to figure out this purposeful availment idea.
So it's not just about a single transaction then.
Yeah.
It's got to be more like a pattern of actively, doing business in that state.
Exactly. And, there have been some really interesting court cases, by the way, that have dealt with these very questions. One that comes to mind is Worldwide Volkswagen. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Volkswagen. Okay, I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, so in that case, you had a family, they bought a car in New York, and then they decided to drive that car to Oklahoma, and that's where they got into an accident.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so they tried to sue the car dealership, but in Oklahoma, arguing that it was foreseeable, right? Like it was predictable that the car might end up there.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem kind of predictable that someone could drive a car to a different state. So did the court, did they side with the family on that one?
They didn't. The Supreme Court actually said that just because it's foreseeable that a product might end up somewhere, that doesn't automatically mean that the seller has purposefully availed themselves of, doing business in that state.
Yeah.
Like this dealership, they didn't direct any actions toward Oklahoma, so the court said it wouldn't be fair to, drag them into court there.
That makes sense. So foreseeability, it's not enough on its own.
Mm-hmm.
What about fairness, though? It seems like that should be a factor in these decisions, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Even if a court finds there are minimum contacts, they also have to consider whether it's reasonable to make the defendant, actually travel to that state for a trial. It's this whole other concept called fair play and substantial justice.
Okay, so they're not just looking at the, like, legal technicalities. They're also thinking about whether it's actually fair to make someone defend themselves in a particular state.
Precisely. And a really good example of this is Burger King v. Rudzovich. Have you heard of that one?
Burger King. I feel like all the best cases involve food.
Right. So in this case, you have these two guys. They opened a Burger King franchise in Michigan,
Okay.
and they signed a contract, right, with Burger King's headquarters, which was down in Florida. But they ended up running into some financial trouble, and, well, they stopped making payments.
Ooh, yeah, I bet Burger King wasn't too thrilled about that.
Not at all.
Did they sue them in Michigan?
Well, they actually sued them in Florida, arguing that the franchise agreement and, this ongoing business relationship these guys had with headquarters in Florida, that was enough to establish jurisdiction there.
Oh, interesting. So I'm guessing those franchise owners, they probably weren't too keen on flying all the way to Florida for a court battle. What does the court say about that?
Well, the Supreme Court, they actually sided with Burger King in the end, but they did make a point of emphasizing that just because you have a contract that says you can be sued in a specific state, that doesn't automatically mean, that jurisdiction in that state is always going to be fair. They looked at all sorts of things, where the parties lived, where the negotiations took place, where the witnesses and evidence were located, things like that.
So even if you have a contract, the court might still step in and say, hold on, is this really the most reasonable and convenient place for this whole thing to go down?
Exactly. The courts, they're trying to find a good balance, Protecting a state's interest in resolving disputes, sure, but also making sure that defendants aren't being unfairly burdened by being forced to litigate in some, far off or inconvenient place.
Okay, so we've talked about, how selling my sourdough online could, like, land me in some legal hot water in another state.
Right.
But what about, like, the big guys?
Yeah.
The companies with, like, offices and operations everywhere. Does selling online open them up to lawsuits, like, anywhere and everywhere?
Well, that's where things get even trickier. See, we've been talking about specific jurisdiction, right? Where the lawsuit is directly related to what the defendant did in that specific state.
Right.
But there's also this whole other thing called general jurisdiction, and that's a whole other ballgame.
General jurisdiction. Okay, that sounds intense. So what makes it so different, Tal?
Think of it this way. With specific jurisdiction, we're talking about a court's power over a company for very specific actions, right? Things related to a specific lawsuit. General jurisdiction, on the other hand, that's about whether a company is so deeply rooted in a state that they can basically be sued there for anything. Doesn't matter where the actual issue started.
Whoa, so even if the lawsuit has nothing to do with their business in that state, they could still get dragged into court there. What would it even take for a company to be on the hook like that?
Yeah, for general jurisdiction, a company has to be, like, really intertwined with a state. Like, it's essentially at home there. Imagine, like, a massive company, right? Maybe they're incorporated in Delaware, their main headquarters is in California, but they've got factories and offices and employees all over the country.
Okay, yeah, I can picture a company like that.
Yeah.
So how does a court even begin to decide which state is truly their home for this whole jurisdiction thing?
Well, it's a tough one. And honestly, the courts have been, like, putting their foot down on this lately. They're making it a lot tougher for companies to be subject to general jurisdiction just because they happen to have a presence in a state.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've made it clear that it takes more than just doing a lot of business in a state. It has to be the company's true, like, nerve center, the place where they make all the big decisions, where they direct their overall business,
So for all our sourdough fans out there maybe wondering, why does any of this matter to me? What's the takeaway? Should we all be, like, brushing up on interstate law before we ship out a loaf of bread?
Well, for our baker friend, I'd say understanding the basics of jurisdiction, especially when you're selling online, is always a good idea. It really highlights how easy it is to, like, unintentionally create these connections with other states just by doing business online.
Right.
But on a bigger scale, these concepts of jurisdiction, they affect all of us as consumers, as people who use the internet.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget that our online actions can have, like, real-world legal consequences.
Exactly. Every click, every purchase, every interaction online, it's potentially creating a tie to another state or even another country.
Wow.
And as technology, continues to blur those lines between physical boundaries, this whole issue of jurisdiction, it's only going to get more and more complicated.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening to say the least. I feel like we went from sourdough newbies to like jurisdiction enthusiasts in the span of an episode. So much to think about when it comes to online business and just like navigating this whole legal world.
It really is. And, it's something to stay aware of because, as we all know, that online world is constantly changing and the law is always trying to catch up.
As always, fascinating stuff. Until next time, happy baking, everyone, and stay jurisdictionally aware.